Imagine waking up in a pile of amphora shards, your toga stained with whatever passed for wine, your head pounding like a Roman drumline. Congratulations, you're hungover in 300 BCE, no electrolytes, no greasy breakfast burrito, just goat's liver, incense, and a wildly misplaced sense of medical confidence. Hangovers have haunted humanity longer than debt, and somehow, ancient people insisted on fixing them with things like fried canary and vinegar foot baths. This is the story of our ancestors waking up with regret and doing absolutely everything wrong about it. Yes, history gets drunk too, and the morning after is a mess. Still clinging to consciousness like a Babylonian after a barley wine binge? Hit like, subscribe, and let's stumble together through the most ridiculous hangover cures in history. No aspirin required. It starts the same way it always does. You wake up on a surface that was never designed for sleeping. It's cold. It's gritty. Possibly stone. Possibly dirt. Your mouth tastes like regret soaked in vinegar. Your head feels like it was used as a drum in a Bronze Age battle. There's something sticky in your hair, and the only thing you're certain of is that it's definitely not honey. Congratulations, you're hungover. But not just any hangover. No, this is a historical hangover, the kind that echoes through time. Not in epic poems or marble statues, but in the soft whimper of a Sumerian man, softly groaning into a clay toilet. See, long before humans discovered penicillin, the wheel, or even the concept of socks, they discovered booze. And where there is booze, there is overconfidence. Where there is overconfidence, there is poor decision-making. And where there is poor decision-making, there is inevitably the morning after. Let that sink in. This is not a modern phenomenon. The ancient world was plastered, from Mesopotamian beer halls to Egyptian wine orgies, from Greek symposiums to Norse mead feasts. Humanity has a long and noble tradition of getting absolutely wrecked, and then pretending it was culturally important. Let's take a stroll through time, shall we? In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a drink, it was currency, religion, and hydration all in one frothy, potentially infection-riddled chalice. Laborers were literally paid in it. It was brewed by priestesses, consumed by children, and worshipped by pretty much everyone. And when someone had a few too many, the Sumerians didn't call it a hangover. They called it the demon of beer. Yes, a literal demon, which is honestly pretty accurate. Then there's Egypt, where wine wasn't just a luxury, it was a hotline to the gods. Festivals dedicated to Hathor involved ritualistic drinking until you heard divine whispers, or possibly just fainted in the sand. Either way, they believed drunkenness brought enlightenment. The next morning, less enlightened. Remedies ranged from cabbage juice to crocodile dung. Yeah, we'll get to that later. Don't worry. Meanwhile, over in Greece, the philosophers weren't just thinking deep thoughts. They were thinking them while slowly sliding off their chairs at drunken banquets. Plato had his symposiums. Socrates had his tolerance. Aristotle had probably a splitting headache he wrote off as academic curiosity. The Greeks tried to be classy about it. They drank watered-down wine and called it moderation. And then they woke up the next day in a pile of goat skins, asking where their sandals went. And then there's Rome. Sweet, over-the-top, roast peacock stuffed with dormice. Rome. The Romans drank like it was a competitive sport. And in a way, it was. They drank wine mixed with resin, seawater, and herbs they definitely couldn't identify. Vomiting mid-feast? Totally acceptable. Having a servant hold your hair back? That's what slaves were for. But the next morning, even emperors weren't spared. Remedies involved everything from fried canary to vinegar foot baths. And this is real, holding an amulet made of ivy to your forehead. Still better than crocodile dung. Of course, not every ancient culture went full Dionysus. In India, alcohol had rules. Ayurveda, the ancient system of medicine, viewed intoxication as a disruption of balance. Their remedies, far more holistic detox rituals, herbal tonics, and sometimes leeches. And in China, it was all about moderation. Rice wine was popular, yes, but so was self-discipline. Unless you were a Tang dynasty poet, in which case you were probably drunk and crying in a garden. What we're saying is, everyone drank, everyone paid for it, and everyone had a theory, or several dozen, about how to cure it. Which raises the real question, why did they keep doing it? That's what this episode is about. Not just the hangovers themselves. Though oh yes, We'll be dragging every wine-sodden mummy and groaning Viking into the spotlight, but the beautifully stupid, deeply human coping mechanisms that came with them. Because in every era, the morning after tells you something about the night before, about what mattered to people, what they feared, what they believed, and how desperately they clung to whatever might make the pounding in their skull go away. We'll look at the science, such as it was, the rituals, the snake oil, the pure, undiluted absurdity, but also the strange tenderness that lies underneath, because a hangover is more than dehydration and regret, it's vulnerability. We're going to walk through 5,000 years of questionable nights and worse mornings, through beer temples, monastic breweries, Persian gardens, Viking longhouses, and plague-ridden taverns. We'll meet priests who doubled as bartenders, philosophers who blamed wine for their existential dread, peasants who swore by eel wine, and nobles who tried to sniff unicorn horns to make it all stop. Picture it. Ancient Mesopotamia, land of rivers, cradle of civilization, inventors of the wheel, cuneiform, and arguably more important, the hangover. Now, it's worth noting that this wasn't an after-hours reward. This was lunch. Beer was the fuel of the working man, and the working woman, and the working child. The Mesopotamian economy basically ran on booze. Beer was safer than water, easier to store than livestock, and arguably more valuable than most husbands. But as night falls and the brewers keep pouring, things start to unravel. You don't remember how many jugs you had. You do remember hugging the ziggurat and calling it your sandstone queen. The stars look like they're spinning. The priest is definitely judging you. Cut to sunrise. Your mouth tastes like regret and barley rot. Your temples are pounding with the rhythm of an angry god, and the clay chamber pot is suddenly the most sacred object in your house. Congratulations, you've got a Sumerian hangover. And the cure? Oh, sweet summer child, the cure is both mystifying and mildly horrifying. See, the Sumerians believed hangovers were caused by malevolent spirits, most notably the beer demon, a supernatural parasite that slipped into your soul while you were dancing around the fire with a flower crown on your head. You didn't just feel like death, you were literally possessed. Which brings us to the first recorded hangover cure, ritual exorcism. That's right. In ancient Mesopotamia, the solution to your pounding head wasn't water and toast. It was chanting burning herbs, and a priest yelling Akkadian obscenities at your liver. Imagine laying there moaning, as a bearded man waves incense over you while whispering to the beer demon to please vacate the premises. You don't need a Gatorade, you need divine intervention. If that didn't work, and spoiler, it usually didn't, there were also some more practical solutions. Clay tablets from the time recommend various hangover potions, many of which read like grocery lists written by someone very drunk while writing them. One remedy included honey mixed with crushed seeds, onion juice, and something ominously translated as soothing root paste. Another suggested goat's milk fermented with herbs, and no joke, traces of copper scraped from temple statues, because nothing says healing like licking sacred oxidized metal. And then there's the ritual shame. You see, Mesopotamian society, while deeply indulgent, also loved a good dose of moralizing. Getting drunk? Socially acceptable. But looking like you got drunk? Not so much. It was customary for the hungover to atone in public. Some would bring offerings to the temple. Others would kneel before a shrine and whisper promises to never touch barley again. Lies, of course, but traditional ones. There are even texts where scribes wrote passive-aggressive poems to friends who partied too hard. One translated fragment reads, "He came to dine, he stayed to wail. His feet found sleep, but not his soul. May his shadow be silent next time." Which is basically ancient Sumerian for, "Bro, you passed out at my place again," and cried into the lentils. But perhaps the most ironic part of it all is this. The very same priests condemning your barley binge, they were probably the ones who brewed it. Yes. In Mesopotamia, the temples were the breweries. Priests and priestesses were often the brewers, because beer wasn't just sustenance, it was sacred. The goddess Ninkasi was literally the deity of brewing. She had a hymn dedicated to her that doubled as a brewing recipe, so your headache wasn't just bad judgment, it was blasphemy. Let that sink in. Your hangover was a spiritual failure. Now, pause for a moment and consider the ridiculous beauty of that. Because here you are, thousands of years later, sipping electrolyte powder, and Googling, does pickle juice actually work? while some poor man in 2800 BCE was laying on a mat, covered in ashes, while a priestess chanted to the beer demon and gently tapped his feet with a sacred spoon. So, would you let your priest prescribe barley gruel and sheep entrails for your pounding headache? No? Well, too bad, because in Babylon, that was the pharmacy. To be fair, they weren't completely clueless. Many of their herbal remedies were mildly effective. Coriander, cumin, mint, plants we still use today to settle the stomach. They just happen to come sandwiched between recite this 38-word incantation while facing east, and rub your temples with goat fat at sunrise. We can laugh now, but these were the early steps of medical science. Pain was a puzzle, alcohol was a mystery, and suffering through both was a kind of sacred rite. Maybe that's why we kept drinking. Not because we forgot how bad it felt, but because hangovers were weirdly communal, a shared human moment. You and your friends, your family, your entire village, all collectively groaning under the sun, promising to be better, knowing full well you wouldn't. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? That the first cities, the first writing, the first laws, they all coexisted with the first bad decisions and the even worse mornings that followed. So yes, the beer demon was real. He's still here, lurking behind $6 IPAs and bottomless brunch. He just doesn't get incense anymore. He gets advert. And speaking of regret wrapped in herbs, let's travel to Egypt, where wine flowed like the Nile and the hangovers were truly divine. So, you've survived the beer demon, barely. And now you find yourself in a new land, one where the sun is always watching, the gods are always judging, and the wine, oh the wine flows like irrigation water down the Nile. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where the architecture is eternal, the cats are sacred, and the hangovers are absolutely biblical. Let's set the mood. It's festival season. Again, which in Egypt was about as rare as sand. Everyone's out, basking in the glory of Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and most relevantly, alcohol fueled bad decisions. She was the original party goddess, the divine patron of the turn-up. Worshippers didn't just sip wine in her honor, they slammed it. Responsibly? Not even close. At the Festival of Drunkenness, which was a real and shockingly official religious event, you were expected to drink until you either passed out or had a spiritual epiphany. Whichever came first. Some passed out under date palms. Others claimed they heard Hathor whispering divine secrets between hiccups. One scholar suspects these secrets were mostly, "Stop chugging." And the next morning? Oh, now we arrive at the truly sacred ritual. Instant regret. You awake sprawled in the sand, face down in what you pray is palm wine and not camel urine. There's a funeral dirge playing somewhere in the distance. Or maybe that's just the ringing in your ears. Either way, your head is throbbing like a cursed sarcophagus. And the gods, the ones you celebrated so enthusiastically last night, have gone oddly silent. You've got yourself a pharaonic hangover. But don't worry, the ancient Egyptians had a whole catalogue of cures. And if you're thinking they involved logic, science, or anything resembling effectiveness, well, let's just say buckle up. First, there's onions. Raw, pungent, eye-watering onions. Eaten, sniffed, rubbed on the skin. Apparently nothing says detox like aggressively assaulting your senses with bulbous root vegetables. Then there's cabbage, which they believed could prevent drunkenness if eaten beforehand. And if you forgot to eat it beforehand, congratulations. Now you just get farty and hungover. Feeling spiritually sick? There's a papyrus spell for that. Literally, ancient hangover incantations were read aloud by temple healers, calling upon divine forces to banish the tremors of wine. It involved holding your breath and chanting something along the lines of, "O you who troubles the head, begone with your burning fire. Let the cool waters of Osiris wash over this afflicted one." Which is poetic and all, but Osiris isn't going to bring you Pedialyte. Now, if you were really hurting, say, post-royal banquet, 8 jars of wine hurting, then you'd move on to the more specialized remedies. And here's where things get dark. And a little poop adjacent. One ancient remedy, reportedly reserved for the truly desperate, or perhaps just the fabulously wealthy and dramatically stubborn, involved a suppository made from crocodile dung. Yes. Let that sink in. They took the literal waste of one of the world's most dangerous reptiles and thought, this should go there. That'll help. Did it? We can confidently say, no, it did not. But you know what it did do? Make you reconsider every life choice that led to this moment. which, if we're being generous, might be what they meant by a spiritual reset. Now, let's not be too harsh. Ancient Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced in other ways. Surgeries, prosthetics, dental tools. But when it came to hangovers, it was a chaotic cocktail of superstition, kitchen leftovers, and vague spiritual bargaining. Still, there was a sort of elegance to it, a weirdly beautiful balance of indulgence and repentance. The idea that you could touch the divine by losing yourself in wine, and then make it right again by whispering apologies to the Nile. In fact, there's a story, possibly apocryphal, but too good to ignore, about a minor noble named Bekotep, who once drank himself into oblivion during a harvest celebration, woke up inside a grain silo, and swore never to drink again unless a god personally handed him the cup. 2 months later, he claimed Hathor appeared in a dream, and offered him a chalice. He started drinking again the next day. That's the thing about Egyptian hangovers, they weren't just biological, they were moral. You had offended balance. You had tipped the cosmic scales. Ma'at, the divine order, was out of whack, because you thought it'd be a good idea to challenge your cousin to a wine-drinking contest in front of a statue of Ra. There's even an inscription in one tomb that reads, "He who drinks to speak with gods shall suffer the silence of the sun," which is ancient Egyptian for, you did this to yourself, dummy. And yet, somehow, they never stopped. The same people who mummified cats, aligned pyramids with stars, and built one of the greatest civilizations in human history, also believed that cabbage juice and crocodile waste could erase 8 hours of wild wine-fueled dancing. It's comforting in a way, because if even the architects of the afterlife couldn't crack the hangover code, maybe we can forgive ourselves for reaching for greasy hash browns and iced coffee. Maybe suffering is just part of the deal. The price of touching ecstasy, even briefly, is waking up covered in dust, holding your sandals like a man who just returned from spiritual war. So yes, ancient Egypt had magic, grandeur, and the occasional divine apparition, but it also had mornings spent sitting in the shade of a palm tree, holding your head and muttering, "Never again, until next year." And if you thought the Egyptians were creative with their hangover cures, just wait until we crash a party in Athens. Spoiler, it involves cabbage. Again, if ancient Egypt gave us divine wine rituals and crocodile-based cures, then ancient Greece gave us something even more confusing. Philosophical hangovers. Now, imagine this. You're reclining, not sitting, reclining, on a plush couch, at a symposium. There's a lyre playing softly in the background, a flute girl hovering awkwardly nearby, and a low table in front of you, scattered with olives, honey cakes, and whatever passed for finger food in 5th century BCE Athens. You're surrounded by men in robes arguing whether justice is a construct or a divine truth, and everyone is slightly sloshed. Welcome to the Greek Symposium, part frat party, part TED Talk, part spiritual breakdown. The Greeks didn't just drink to forget, they drank to think, to unlock truths about the universe, to wax poetic about virtue, while projectile vomiting into a decorative urn. But don't be fooled by the drama masks and marble busts. These guys were hypocrites of the highest order. Let's take a closer look. At first glance, it seems like they had it figured out. Wine? Sure, but always mixed with water. It was considered barbaric to drink it straight. That was what Thracians did. Animals? Real Greeks? They watered it down, usually at a 3:1 ratio, and then proceeded to drink it for 6 hours straight while debating metaphysics. So moderation, in theory, but in practice. The same philosophers who preached temperance were also the ones face-planting into fig baskets and blaming Dionysus for their lack of self-control. Even Plato, the poster boy of wisdom, wrote about ideal societies that banned excessive drinking, while simultaneously describing parties where Socrates drank everyone under the table, and then kept lecturing without slurring. Which raises the obvious question, what kind of monster gets smarter when drunk? Socrates, apparently. He was said to remain lucid after massive amounts of wine, calmly dismantling people's worldviews while everyone else passed out or started hitting on the harpist. But not everyone had the constitution of a mythical buzzkill. Most Greeks, when faced with the brutal morning after, turned to a very familiar solution, cabbage. Again, yes, cabbage makes its triumphant return, raw, boiled, or in the form of an unspeakable broth. Some sources say it was consumed before drinking to prevent hangovers. Others say it was chewed the next day to cure them. Either way, It always tasted like punishment. Another remedy: goat hooves. Not as in eating them though, knowing the Greeks maybe someone tried, but rather boiling them into a gelatinous soup, believed to soothe the stomach and restore balance, which is a fancy way of saying please make the nausea stop, Hera. I promise I'll never quote Euripides while drunk again. And of course, the ever-reliable nap under an olive tree, a method favoured by poets and shepherds alike. Because if you can't cure the hangover, at least you can do it somewhere scenic. But behind all the goat-based stews and leafy chewables lurked a deeper irony. The Greeks were obsessed with balance, moderation, temperance, harmony. The idea of sophrosine, self-control, wisdom, restraint was central to Greek ethics, and yet their parties often ended with naked dancing, public urination, and deeply regrettable poetry. It's almost like they knew they were being hypocrites and just didn't care. There's a beautiful contradiction in that. A kind of honesty, because who among us hasn't stood in front of a mirror, clutching a greasy sandwich, muttering, "Never again," only to make the exact same mistake 3 nights later at Becky's birthday? Ancient Greek physicians didn't help, either. While Hippocrates, the father of medicine and professional buzzkill, advised drinking water, resting, and applying cool compresses, other doctors offered less practical solutions. One suggestion: sniffing burnt deer antler ash. Another: holding amulets cast with verses from Homer. Because nothing says hydration like a magical goat bone, but maybe we're being too hard on them. After all, these were the people who turned drunkenness into theatre. Literally, Dionysian festivals were massive, days-long orgies of wine, performance and spiritual release. Drinking was an act of communion with the divine. The goal wasn't to feel good the next day. It was to transcend, if only for a moment. One philosopher, Anacharsis, a Scythian, visiting Athens, once remarked that the Greeks fight at festivals and discuss peace in war. He also said that the symposiums were like battles, except nobody dies and everyone smells like raisins, which honestly sounds about right. There's a particularly poignant story about a young Athenian named Theros, who attended his first symposium with high hopes and a full bladder. He overindulged on diluted wine, got into an argument about whether beauty was objective or a social construct, tried to recite Sappho from memory, and passed out face down in the salad. The next morning, he woke up on a mosaic floor, with "Democracy is a scam" written on his arm in charcoal. He reportedly swore off parties for a year, and instead joined a tragic theatre troupe. So, what does this tell us? That even in the birthplace of logic, even in the land of great thinkers and self-proclaimed sages, nobody had the answer to the age-old question, why do I feel like death warmed over, and why did I tell Dorian I loved him? Because the Greeks, despite their statues and symposiums, were just like us, messy, vain, insecure, and occasionally prone to philosophical breakdowns after 4 bowls of wine and an argument about fate. And honestly, that's kind of comforting. So next time you wake up with a headache and a deep sense of cosmic embarrassment, just remember, Plato probably did too. He just had better lighting. Now if you think goat hooves and cabbage were questionable, wait until we get to Rome, where hangovers weren't just inconvenient, they were practically an art form. If ancient Greece was the birthplace of reason, then Rome was the birthplace of the absolutely not my problem lifestyle. By the time the Romans rolled onto the scene, moderation had gone the way of the saber-toothed squirrel. They didn't just drink, they curated the experience of overindulgence like it was an Olympic sport. You weren't just getting drunk, you were participating in history. Badly. Let's begin with the basics. Roman wine was everywhere. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a defining feature of Roman identity, right up there with aqueducts, sandals, and complaining about Gauls. Rich or poor, patrician or pleb, you were expected to imbibe. If you didn't drink wine, were you even Roman? No, you were suspicious. Now, let's be clear. Roman wine wasn't exactly what you'd call palatable. It was often syrupy, oxidized, and stored in clay amphorae that doubled as flavor experiments gone horribly wrong. To fix this, they mixed it with everything from seawater to herbs, honey, ashes, resin, and sometimes lead, for taste. So imagine you're a Roman senator. You've just finished a 6-course dinner featuring dormice stuffed with minced pork and honey-glazed flamingo tongues. You've washed it down with 6 cups of Falernian wine, one of them laced with something vaguely described as imported tree essence. The lyre players have stopped playing. The guests are groaning. Someone's wrestling a goose. And yet, you keep going, because this is Rome, and decadence is discipline. Cut to the next morning. You awaken in your villa courtyard. There's vomit near the statue of Bacchus. Your toga is inside out. Your mouth tastes like regret and antique vinegar. And your head is hosting the Battle of Actium. You reach for something, anything, that might make the spinning stop. Enter Roman hangover cures. And, oh, they had ideas. Let's start strong, raw owl eggs. Yes, crack one open, slurp it down. Bonus points if consumed before sunrise. Why owls? Because they're nocturnal, obviously, and clearly understand the consequences of nightlife. Next up, fried canary. Not boiled, not stewed, fried. The logic was murky at best, but somewhere in the scrolls of ancient wisdom, someone decided that consuming a tiny songbird, wings and all, might settle your stomach. It did not, and then there's the infamous vinegar foot rub. According to Pliny the Elder, a man who never met a weird cure, he didn't immediately write down, the fastest way to clear a hangover was to soak your feet in vinegar while sipping more wine. That's right, drink more, rub your feet, ignore reality. Classic Rome. Now, Pliny also recommended rubbing boiled cabbage leaves on your forehead, while chewing fennel seeds soaked in goat milk. This, apparently, would cool the humours. We're not sure what it cooled, but it definitely heated up the smell in the atrium. Let's not forget the garum-based elixirs. Garum being fermented fish sauce, so pungent it could destroy friendships. Some Romans swore by a garum and honey concoction as the ultimate hangover tonic. Others swore at it, probably both. But perhaps no figure embodies the hangover excess of Rome more than Lucullus, the patron saint of over-the-top dinner parties. This was a man who once served 100 different dishes made of peacock to a party of 5. He threw banquets for ghosts. He built dining rooms that rotated with the stars. Lucullus's morning routine? Unknown. But it probably involved slaves holding scented sponges to his temples while someone read aloud from Ovid and another poor soul fanned away the scent of last night's oyster pie. The Roman elite didn't just treat hangovers, they outsourced them. Servants were expected to mop up the shame, physically and metaphorically. One account describes a wealthy matron who ordered her slaves to brew a remedy of roses, ash and pigeon tongue, and apply it to her chest while reciting poetry. Healing? No. Dramatic? Absolutely. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of rose ash and songbirds. The lower classes, they just suffered. Or, if they were lucky, chewed licorice root and lay in the shade praying their master didn't summon them for more wine errands. And what about the philosophers? Well, Seneca, the Roman moralist who preached about restraint while bathing in marble tubs, once said that drunkenness is nothing but voluntary madness. He wasn't wrong, but he also attended Nero's banquets, where the wine flowed like blood and the hangovers were likely criminal. Which brings us to Nero himself. No, he probably didn't cure a hangover by setting someone's house on fire, but it's very on brand, because the Romans, for all their engineering brilliance and legislative legacy, were disasters when it came to moderation. They invented public toilets, but still thought fermented bird eggs were medicinal. They conquered half the known world, but never figured out how to sleep off a bender without involving a goose feather and a toga stained with seafood sauce. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there's a sliver of something tender, something human. A man, waking up groggy under columns, clutching his temples, whispering to the gods to make the sunlight stop. A servant boy pouring diluted wine into a chipped goblet, offering it wordlessly. A philosopher scribbling in the margins of a scroll. Next time, stop at cup 4. They were us. Just with more marble and fewer electrolytes. So next time you wake up and try to wash your face with your roommate's bong water, thinking it's mouthwash, remember, you have options. Romans had foot vinegar and owl yolks. You have coffee and ibuprofen. Use them. And on that note, let's leave the forum behind and take a long, spicy journey east, where Ayurveda meets hangovers and your stomach meets milk boiled with 10 bitter things. If Roman hangovers were treated with raw eggs, vinegar foot spas and an alarming number of deceased birds, ancient India took a slightly more, let's call it, holistic approach. Welcome to the subcontinent, where balance was king, spices were medicine, and people actually tried to fix hangovers without accidentally poisoning themselves. Shocking, I know. Now, let's set the stage. It's sometime around 1500 BCE, and you're waking up in the early Vedic period. You're lying on a woven reed mat in a hut that smells like incense, ghee, and your own bad decisions. The sun is up, the birds are chirping. Your soul, however, is trying to claw its way out of your skull. You were at a feast last night, celebrating the harvest, the full moon, or maybe just the fact that your neighbor finally stopped playing that awful bamboo flute. Whatever the reason, you had one too many bowls of surah, a strong, cloudy brew made from rice, sugarcane, or fruit that tasted like fermented ambition, and left behind the emotional equivalent of a bus crash. And now, you need help. But unlike your Mesopotamian or Roman cousins, who would be busy trying to balance their humors with animal grease, you've got Ayurveda on your side, one of the oldest and most detailed medical systems humanity's ever cooked up, complete with its own diagnosis charts, body type, and deeply concerning instructions involving butter. According to Ayurveda, you are not just hungover. No, you have disrupted your doshas, the three energies that govern your body: vata, air; pitta, fire; and kapha, earth. Right now, all three of those are throwing a tantrum. So what do? Step 1. Stop panicking. You're not being punished by a beer demon. You're experiencing ama, a lovely Sanskrit word that roughly translates to gross bodily sludge. It's the result of poor digestion, bad behavior, and cosmic imbalance. In other words, you're spiritually bloated. So what's the cure? Well, let's start with something mild. Warm water with ginger and black pepper. Sounds pretty modern, right? Toss in some honey and you've basically got a detox tea that influencers would sell for $29. Still nauseous? Enter amla juice, made from Indian gooseberries. Tart, sour, and potent enough to make your face fold inward. Amla is packed with vitamin C and Ayurvedic smugness. It soothes pitta, they'd say, while casually ignoring the fact that it also makes you cry. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe your hangover is next level. The I might never walk again variety. Now you're getting into the heavy hitters. Ghee enemas and milk boiled with 10 bitter things. Yes, 10 bitter things. According to the Charaka Samhita, one of Ayurveda's founding texts, this potent concoction would purge your system, cool your liver, and potentially traumatize your taste buds. The ingredients included herbs like neem, charata, and something called devil's dung, which is both a plant and an accurate description of how your mouth will feel afterward. And if you're still not cured, time for leech therapy. That's right, they believed a few well-placed leeches could suck the heat from your system and restore your body's balance. Not ideal, but hey, at least no one's making you eat owl parts. Now, before you laugh too hard, let's acknowledge something important here. Ayurveda was weirdly ahead of its time. Where other cultures burned incense and hoped for the best, Ayurveda emphasized things like hydration, rest, and gentle nutrition. It recommended soups, warm oils, breathing exercises, and abstaining from stimuli. All things your modern doctor might quietly nod at. There was even a focus on mental state. If you woke up ashamed, guilty, or emotionally rattled, Ayurvedic texts would urge meditation, journaling, or talking to a healer. They didn't just treat the body, they treated the person. Revolutionary stuff, especially when compared to rubbing fish sauce on your face and praying to Jupiter. And yet, there were still some choices. Like the man who reportedly cured his hangover by sitting in a hot clay pit while chanting mantras and drinking clarified butter until he hallucinated a swan. Or the story of a healer named Bhaskar, who once instructed a merchant to sweat out the sin by walking into a monsoon while wearing wool. Effective? Debatable. Dramatic? Always. But perhaps the most striking thing about Ayurveda's approach to hangovers was that it didn't see them as isolated. It wasn't you drank too much, here's a cabbage. It was something in your life is out of harmony. Let's unpack that. Which is kind of beautiful. Imagine waking up, head pounding, mouth dry, and instead of being handed a greasy sandwich and told to suffer in silence, someone sits beside you, hands you a warm herbal drink, and says, "Tell me where it hurts, not just your head." Let that sink in, because yes, Ayurveda had its oddities. Milk and leeches aren't everyone's cup of chai, but it also offered something our ancestors desperately needed. A pause, a moment to reflect, a gentle nudge toward equilibrium in a world that often spun wildly out of control. Sometimes after 3 cups of fermented mango pulp. So next time you're spiraling through a hangover and thinking, what even is my liver doing? Take a note from ancient India. Maybe the answer isn't more aspirin. Maybe it's ginger, rest, and just a little spiritual recalibration. Still watching with both eyes open? You deserve it. Give this video a like, your liver would approve. Now let's head further east, where ancient China had its own ideas. And yes, they involve dried citrus peels, acupuncture, and the occasional imperial poet regretting everything. The year is 221 BCE. You wake up beneath a silk canopy in a Han Dynasty bedroom that smells faintly of incense, tea leaves, and mistakes. Your tongue feels like it's been marinated in soy sauce and regret. Your head is pounding, not in a Western way, where you yell about coffee and aspirin, but in a deeply philosophical, vaguely poetic way. Welcome to ancient China, where even your hangovers have balance, symbolism, and dried tangerine peel. Alcohol in early China wasn't just popular, it was practically required. From court banquets to ancestral rites, rice wine, known as Jiu, flowed freely through dynasties like an uninvited cousin who refuses to leave. It was offered to ancestors, spilled on altars, consumed in elaborate ceremonies, and sometimes just chugged in the back room of a poetry contest gone off the rails. But the morning after, that was between you and Confucius. Because in Chinese medicine, hangovers weren't just unfortunate, they were imbalanced. Your yin and yang had gotten into a bar fight. Your qi was now curled in a corner somewhere, muttering about how it was totally fine. Ancient doctors weren't concerned with symptoms, they were concerned with flow. So, what caused your suffering? According to traditional medicine, it was heat in the liver, a poetic way of saying, you poisoned yourself and now your internal fire is roasting your soul. The cure? Cool it down. Gently, strategically, with plan. Let's begin with the big one, tea. Specifically, chrysanthemum or kudzu root tea. Known for cooling properties, these drinks soothed the liver, cleared the mind, and, if you steep them properly, tasted only mildly like bitter grass, mixed with eternal sorrow. Next came dried citrus peel, usually tangerine. It was steeped, chewed, or made into a soup with ginger. Why? Because citrus was thought to unblock qi, settle the stomach, and give you something to do besides lying on a mat moaning into your sleeves. Another favorite, pickle juice. Yes, even in ancient China, people believed salty fermented vegetables could magically cancel out a night of terrible choices. This leads to the world's first possible invention of hangover soup, a hot broth made of tofu, scallions, mustard greens, vinegar, and pickled radish. Savory, salty, spicy, also known as please forgive me soup. And if your stomach was still staging a rebellion, you'd try acupuncture. That's right, someone would gently poke needles into your feet, head and wrists to redirect energy, open meridians, and hopefully shut down the internal screaming. You'd lie there in total silence with bamboo music playing in the background, wondering how a night of wine poems turned into acupuncture therapy and a grown man massaging your spleen line. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Ancient Chinese scholars and poets didn't just suffer through hangovers, they wrote about them, they immortalized them. They turned nausea into verse and dizziness into wisdom. Take Li Bai, the famous Tang Dynasty poet, known as the Immortal of Wine. He once claimed to have composed over 1,000 poems while drunk. Many of them were about nature, friendship, and yes, the aftermath. One line goes, I drank alone with the moon and my shadow. I woke with none of them left. Translation, I got blitzed in the garden, and now I feel abandoned, and extremely dehydrated. But even Li Bai, wine-soaked sage that he was, acknowledged the sadness beneath the bliss. Another poem reads, drunkenness brings joy. Awakening, sorrow. It wasn't just about the headache, it was the existential weight of waking up, realizing your soul might have overshared again. Imagine being hungover and responsible for inventing a new poetic meter. Brutal. Confucianism, meanwhile, frowned upon overindulgence. Moderation was the rule. Discipline, temperance. A proper gentleman did not stagger into the court reeking of rice wine and dumplings, and yet, many of the same scholars who preached this managed to sneak away to private drinking parties filled with food, music, and whispered regrets. One particularly juicy tale comes from the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, a group of eccentric scholars during the Wei and Jin dynasties. They rejected formality, lived wildly, and drank heavily under bamboo trees. One member, Ruan Ji, reportedly stayed drunk for 60 days straight, claiming it kept him honest in a dishonest world. His hangover remedy: silence, meditation, and the occasional bowl of something that smelled like despair and fennel. Of course, not everyone was a poetic drunkard. Everyday people, farmers, artisans, merchants, had their own traditions. If you were poor, you drank cheap millet wine and slept in a straw bed until the world stopped spinning. Your cure was likely warm porridge, pickled mustard root, or whatever leftover soup hadn't spoiled overnight. No incense, no poetry, just a slow crawl back to functionality. And yet, even among the common folk, there was an understanding that hangovers were a spiritual imbalance, a signal, a quiet, aching reminder that joy must be met with stillness, that chaos requires pause, that a night of laughter and toasts will always come with a bill. Let that sink in. Because in the middle of all this herbal wisdom and delicate philosophy is a deeply human truth. Even in the most refined of cultures, people got wrecked and then desperately tried to unfry their brains with hot soup and orange peels. So if you're ever lying in bed with your stomach doing interpretive dance and your head ringing like a gong, just imagine Levi mumbling into a bowl of tofu soup, whispering, "I drank the moon, and now I regret everything." You're not alone. You're in good company. Poetic, acupuncture-pierced company. Now, prepare your stomach, because we're about to head north into the land of mead halls, onion broth, and post-battle hangovers so severe they needed sagas to explain them. If ancient China approached hangovers with tea, poetry, and quiet introspection, the Vikings approached them with the subtlety of a headbutt to the chest. Welcome to the Norse world. Cold winds, long nights, fur cloaks, and mead. So much mead. Mead before war, mead after war, mead during funerals, weddings, goat blessing ceremonies, and casual Tuesday afternoons. If rice wine whispered, mead shouted. And when you woke up the next morning feeling like Thor had slammed his hammer directly into your frontal lobe, that was just part of the package. Let's start with the setting. You're a Norse farmer-warrior hybrid, fresh from a feast in the longhouse. The night was rowdy. You drank from a drinking horn carved with runes you couldn't read. You toasted to ancestors, gods, and that one guy who fell in the fire pit but was fine. There were songs, boasts, probably a wrestling match with a dog. Now, the sun has returned far too early and far too bright, and you are sprawled on a pile of straw, wearing one boot and a dead-eyed expression. Your head is splitting, your stomach is staging a rebellion, your tongue is drier than a saga recital. Welcome to the Viking hangover. So what did they do? Well, not much. The Vikings, known for their resilience and disdain for complaining, didn't exactly have a rich catalogue of hangover cures. Mostly, they suffered in silence, sometimes in the snow. But let's break down what we do know and what the sagas suggest. First up, onion broth, a hot, greasy, pungent mess of boiled onions, leftover bones, herbs, and possibly beer from last night if no one was watching. This was believed to warm the belly and chase out the cold, which may be Norse for make you burp enough to stop crying. Next, more mead. Yes, the hair of the frost-bitten dog. Just like Romans and modern brunch-goers, Vikings believed a little alcohol could ease the pain, or numb it, or, at the very least, distract you long enough to get back to hauling logs and judging the Swedes. Then there's snow bathing. Some warriors would roll in the snow or plunge into icy streams, claiming it shocked the weakness out. Realistically, it probably just made them focus on their immediate risk of hypothermia instead of their nausea. Effective? Debatable. Dramatic? Undoubtedly. But what's really telling is what the Norse didn't do. No priests waving incense. No jars of pickled owl parts. No 87-step detox rituals. Instead, the Viking hangover was worn like a badge. A silent agreement that if you were strong enough to drink like a berserker, you were strong enough to suffer like one. And suffer they did. The sagas, those epic tales of love, war, and deeply toxic masculinity, occasionally allude to the aftermath of drinking binges. One Icelandic story recounts a warrior named Ketil Flatnose, who drank so heavily after a victory that he woke up, vomited in a snowbank, killed 3 men, and then calmly went fishing. A king among men, or a cautionary tale in boots. Another saga features a character named Thorstein, who after a night of horn-deep drinking, Spent the entire next day lying in a field, whispering Norse poetry to a squirrel. The meaning is unclear. The hangover is not. But what really sets the Norse approach apart is the emotional philosophy beneath it. They didn't see hangovers as something to be cured. They were earned. The sign that you'd honored your host, participated in joy and lived, however briefly, like a scald on fire. Honor mattered more than comfort. And yes, they had herbs like yarrow and juniper that may have helped with nausea or inflammation, but using them for a hangover? That felt weak. You'd be more likely to chew them after a sword wound than after a drinking game gone wrong. Even their gods offered no sympathy. Odin, chief among the pantheon, was a drinker but not exactly a hangover whisperer. He gave humans poetry and battle frenzy, not ibuprofen and a wet rag. Still, there's something oddly comforting about that. Because beneath the frost and bravado, the Vikings were humans. With headaches, with regrets, with moments lying face down on fur rugs, wondering if it was worth drinking out of a communal horn that smelled like old reindeer. And in those moments, they did what we all do. They got up. They shook it off. They looked at the horizon and muttered something poetic like, "The sun mocks me, but I will endure." There's even a story tucked into a lesser-known saga about a Norse blacksmith who made himself a ritual breakfast after every feast. Onion broth, dried fish, and a brief apology to his goat for whatever happened the night before. He called it the feast after the feast. That's basically a Viking brunch. So no, they didn't have miracle cures, but they did have resilience, humor, and the world's coldest natural ice packs. Let that sink in. Centuries before Bloody Marys and recovery smoothies, people were crawling out of snowbanks, squinting at the sky, and choosing to laugh instead of cry, or cry inside, stoically with a bear pelt over their head. So the next time you wake up, clutching your phone and piecing together a blurry series of Instagram stories and emotional damage, remember, somewhere, long ago, a Viking did the same, minus the phone, plus a wolfskin cloak and a nosebleed. And with that, let's trade furs for robes and explore the world of beer brewing monks, divine hangover confessions, and the sacred art of regretting everything in silence. Imagine waking up in a stone chamber, your robes twisted, your tonsure askew, your mouth tasting like stale incense and regret. A bell tolls in the distance, matins the morning prayer. But you are not ready for divine light. You are medievally hungover. Welcome to the quiet, cloistered world of monks, where chastity, poverty, and obedience reigned supreme, except when it came to alcohol. See, monasteries were the breweries of the medieval world. Their beer, legendary. Their wine, flowing like holy water. Their hangovers, well, let's say not entirely included in the vows. Let's set the scene. An 11th century Benedictine abbey, nestled in the damp hills of Normandy. Last night was Saint Bibiana's feast, the patron saint of hangovers. Yes, she exists. The church has a sense of humour. The monks gathered to celebrate, and by celebrate we mean brew up enough ale to bless the entire village and half of France. The result? One monk is currently face down in a psalter. Another is leaning against a barrel and whispering a prayer for death. The abbot walks by, clutching his head, muttering in Latin. Translation? Never again. But here's the twist. They genuinely believed drinking was spiritual. Monks brewed beer not just for themselves, but for pilgrims, visitors, and the sick. It was safer than water and considered a form of sustenance. Monastic beer was called liquid bread, packed with calories, and unfortunately regrets. So how did the holiest of hangovers get handled? Let's start with the most obvious medieval solution, fasting. Nothing clears the soul or stomach like abstaining from food while your liver does medieval CPR. Monks believed that suffering purified the spirit, so what better opportunity than a skull-splitting headache and a gut full of regret? Next we have cold water immersion. No, not trendy spa treatments, just a bucket. Monks would dunk their heads or faces into icy water, sometimes from a nearby spring, believing it would shock the devil of indulgence right out. Honestly, not the worst idea. And of course, prayer. Oh yes, the ultimate medieval remedy. Some monks wrote entire prayers begging for relief from the pounding within mine head. In one surviving manuscript, a monk named Brother Anselm composed a morning chant that basically says, "Lord, I swear that was my last cup, probably. But hangovers weren't always punished. Sometimes they were treated. Medieval monasteries were also centers of medical knowledge, and monks experimented with herbal concoctions that doubled as medicinal and divine. Popular remedies included mint tea for nausea, chamomile and lavender for headaches, and, in one alarming recipe, a paste of wormwood and rose petals, which you were supposed to snort. Yes, snort, in a church. The famed Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun, composer and proto-influencer, even wrote that wine should be diluted with the clarity of water, lest it fog the heart and cloud the mind. Wise words, frequently ignored. Now here's where things get interesting. You'd think a monk would try to hide his hangover. Not so. In fact, some monastic journals detail their suffering quite candidly, probably because in a life of celibacy and silence, whining about your headache was one of the few joys you had. In one delightful entry, a Cistercian monk wrote, "My belly rages like the devil's forge, and I know not if it be the barley or my sin." That's poetry, but hangovers also served a deeper purpose. In a world defined by extremes, silence versus chant, fasting versus feasting, the physical crash after celebration was seen as a spiritual reckoning, a reminder that even joy must be tempered, that the flesh is weak and sometimes deeply dehydrated. It was also, arguably, a community bonding experience. Picture it, a row of hungover monks sitting on stone benches, eyes glazed, silently passing mint leaves like contraband. That's brotherhood. That's shared humanity. Still, even in their pain, monks innovated. Some monasteries created hangover elixirs, early tinctures made with herbs steeped in wine, irony alert, stored in tiny bottles. These were passed around discreetly, often under the table, like the medieval version of Gatorade. One abbey even blessed its hangover tonic, believing it carried the intercession of Saint Raphael, the healing archangel, divine hydration if you will. There's also speculation that holy water was sometimes just heavily diluted beer, used to hydrate while praying, without triggering another round of skull-splitting regret. After all, nobody wants to pass out during Vespers, unless you think this was all confined to a few rowdy monasteries. Records show this was widespread. Across France, Germany, England, monks brewed, monks drank, monks paid the price. The only thing that changed was the recipe, and how long they had to chant afterward. But perhaps the most touching part, despite the nausea, the dizziness, and the questionable choices made under candlelight, the monks never stopped showing up. They prayed, they worked, they sang off-key with pounding heads, because even in pain they believed they were serving something higher. So maybe, just maybe, the medieval hangover wasn't just punishment. Maybe it was penance, reflection, a reminder that joy and regret often live in the same bottle, and that even those devoted to God are, well, still very human. Let that sink in. Beneath the chanting and incense there were men nursing headaches, rubbing their temples and whispering, "Blessed be the person who invents hangover prevention." Spoiler, we're still waiting. And with that we leave the abbey behind and move east into a world where alcohol was not sacred, but forbidden, and yet, somehow still found its way in. Let's begin with something radical. A civilization that looked alcohol squarely in the eye and said, "Nah, that's not to say they didn't drink. Humans are nothing if not consistent in their ability to do the exact opposite of what they're told." But during the Islamic Golden Age, the official position on alcohol was as clear as the desert sky: haram, forbidden, spiritually toxic, morally frowned upon, a one-way ticket to divine disapproval, which makes the hangovers all the more awkward. But let's rewind. In 7th century Arabia, when the Prophet Muhammad declared alcohol off-limits, it wasn't just about sobriety, it was a revolution. Wine was everywhere, poetry was drenched in it, social gatherings practically ran on fermented date juice. Declaring it forbidden, that was the cultural equivalent of banning oxygen at a toga party. Still, for those who took the command seriously, it wasn't just a rule, it was an aspiration. Sobriety became an ethical badge, a mark of inner discipline. And yet, the wine kept flowing, quietly, shamefully, in dusty back rooms and behind palace walls. That's where our story picks up. Welcome to 9th century Baghdad, the intellectual crown jewel of the Islamic world. Here, scholars wrote encyclopedias, astronomers mapped the stars, and behind closed doors, certain poets got absolutely plastered on pomegranate wine. One such poet, Abu Nuwas. He wrote some of the most gloriously intoxicated verses in Arabic literature. One gem reads, "Drink wine, for it is the milk of lions and the delight of the heart." Bold words for someone living in a culture that considered wine the spiritual equivalent of battery acid. But here's where it gets interesting. Even forbidden wine had consequences. And those consequences, same as always, headaches, dry mouth, stomach like a war zone. So what did the scholars of sobriety do when they weren't quite so sober? They documented it. Take Al-Razi, a polymath physician who basically lived 3 lifetimes worth of knowledge. He wrote treatises on medicine, chemistry, and crucially for our purposes, the effects of alcohol. He didn't exactly condone it, but he did break down hangovers like a man who had seen things. According to Al-Razi, hangovers were the result of excessive heat in the stomach and brain. His advice? Sleep, cold water compressors, avoid fatty foods, maybe take a walk, and, my personal favorite, self-criticism. Yes, the medieval Islamic hangover cure included guilt as an active ingredient. But Al-Razi wasn't the only one. Another physician, Avicenna Ibn Sina, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, a book so foundational it was still being used in European universities 500 years later, included a section on alcohol's effects. He didn't approve of drinking, but he did outline its medical fallout: swelling, fatigue, nausea, the classics. And while Avicenna's hangover advice was a bit more conservative, mostly rest and hydration, he did note that roasted eggplant with vinegar could help settle the stomach. Delicious. Also slightly suspicious. Meanwhile, the philosophers of the era took a different approach. To them, the hangover wasn't just physical, it was spiritual imbalance, a sign that the soul had strayed. Think of it as the ultimate moral hangover. Regret wasn't just internal, it was cosmically embarrassing. Which brings us to the most poetic contradiction of the age: wine poetry. Despite prohibition, Islamic literature, especially Persian, is dripping with intoxication metaphors. The wine became a symbol of divine love, the beloved, or the ecstasy of enlightenment. But let's not kid ourselves, sometimes it was just wine. And hangovers? Hidden between the lines. Poet Omar Khayyam, whose verses are still tattooed on biceps and thrown on coffee mugs, famously wrote, "A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and that." Romantic, yes. But elsewhere his poetry hints at the crash after the high, lines about sorrow, aching heads, and the emptiness of indulgence. The party always had a morning after, and it wasn't just literary. In palace culture, especially under the Abbasid Caliphate, private parties known as majlis were hosted by caliphs who very publicly enforced Islamic law, and very privately hired musicians, dancers, and wine stewards. It was complicated. One caliph was said to hold wine nights every Thursday, every Friday, repentance, and probably herbal tea. And yet, despite all the behind-the-scenes indulgence, the public culture of sobriety held strong. Why? Because the hangover wasn't just about pain, it was about shame. Unlike other cultures that joked about the morning after, here it was often a moral crisis. The hangover became symbolic, the body's proof of transgression, a divine receipt for your sins. Which is why remedies weren't just herbal, they were spiritual. Morning rituals involved ablutions, ritual washings to purify body and soul, recitations of istighfar, the plea for forgiveness, and sometimes self-imposed exile from social gatherings for a while. You know, the medieval version of "I'm never drinking again" with actual consequences. So what can we take from all this? In the Islamic Golden Age, hangovers weren't normalized, they were hushed, which didn't make them less real. If anything, it made them more personal, more reflective. There was a dignity in their silence, a kind of quiet understanding that indulgence has a cost, and recovery is as much about the soul as it is the stomach. Still, let's not pretend everyone learned the lesson. The poetry kept coming, the wine kept flowing in private, and the hangovers, they came, as they always do, with pounding heads and whispered regrets. Because in every era, in every corner of the world, someone wakes up thinking, was that really worth it? Spoiler, probably not. And with that, we leave the dusty libraries of Baghdad and cross oceans, mountains and jungle canopies, to a place where alcohol was sacred, fermented in clay jars, and sometimes chewed into existence by someone else's mouth. Buckle up. Picture this. You're in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, surrounded by the sounds of flutes, drums, and celebratory shouting. You've just downed your fourth gourd of pulque, a foamy, fermented sap of the agave plant that tastes somewhere between wet socks and spiritual enlightenment. The stars are spinning. Your ancestors are probably judging you. And tomorrow's going to hurt. Welcome to the ancient Americas, where alcohol wasn't just a beverage but a full-blown religious experience, followed by hangovers that could only be described as mythologically bad. Let's start with the Aztecs. These were people who built floating gardens, worshipped feathered serpents, and had very strong opinions on how many drinks were too many. Hint: 1, maybe 2 if you were old. Pulque, their sacred brew, was consumed during festivals and rituals, but drunkenness, that was a sin, a punishable one. As in, public shaming, shaved heads, and let's all point at this guy during the ceremony levels of regret. But hangovers still happened. Even priests overdid it occasionally, especially during religious ceremonies honoring the gods of drunkenness, like Umatokli, the rabbit-faced deity of intoxication. And when that holy buzz wore off, the Aztecs had solution. One method was forced vomiting, not the elegant kind either. Think charcoal-infused teas and feather throat ticklers, because in their worldview illness, including hangovers, was about balance. Too much heat, too much cold, too much partying. Your body had to purge it out, sometimes quite literally. They also relied on herbal infusions, brewed from plants like epazote, mint, and cacao bark. Some claimed to settle the stomach. Others were believed to quiet the gods inside you. Translation: stop the room from spinning and the walls from whispering. And if none of that worked, you went to the sweat lodge. Enter the Temazcal, a dome-shaped sauna built from volcanic rock and designed to make you sweat like a guilty politician at a tribunal. Shamans would pour water over hot stones while chanting prayers, and you'd sit in that steam-filled womb until your sins, and hopefully your hangover, left the building, along with most of your body fluids. Cross over into the Inca Empire, high in the Andes, and you'll find another divine drink, chica, a maize beer so sacred it was brewed by chosen women, often noble virgins who were trained from childhood in the arts of fermentation and hospitality. And how did they make it? They chewed the corn, then spit it out into jars, where it fermented into what we'll call mouth wine. Yes, you drank someone else's chewed up corn juice, and you liked it. Sort of. And when the ceremonial binge led to the ceremonial regret, the Inca turned to ritual purification, bathing in cold rivers, burning sacred herbs like Palo Santo, and, in some cases, consulting shamans who would read your symptoms as signs from the spirits. One unlucky man, according to Andean oral tradition, claimed he was cursed to hiccup for 3 straight days after stealing someone else's ceremonial chica, a spiritual hiccup hangover. Nature is healing. The Maya, meanwhile, brewed their own versions of alcohol from honey, bark, and fermented fruit, and they took their rituals seriously. Drinking was often done in connection to trance states, bloodletting, and communing with the gods. It wasn't about the party, it was about spiritual transformation. But when the transformation felt more like a migraine wrapped in regret, they turned to ceremonial enemas. Yes, you heard that correctly. Maya priests would administer herbal and alcohol-based enemas as part of religious rites, sometimes to induce visions, sometimes to cleanse the body after, too many visions. If you're wondering whether a hangover cure has ever included both hallucinogenic herbs and the business end of a hollow gourd, the answer is absolutely yes. Meanwhile, in North America, indigenous tribes had a range of fermented brews, often made from fruit, corn, or honey. The Apache and Pueblo peoples, for example, crafted mild ceremonial drinks, but generally discouraged overindulgence. When it did happen, the remedies were closer to spiritual than pharmaceutical. Suffering through a hangover meant you dishonored the balance. The remedy? Fasting. Isolation. Sitting in the desert and thinking about what you'd done. You know, the original silent retreat, minus the yoga mats and Instagram influencers. There's also record of root brews, mixtures of licorice root, wild ginger, and yarrow, said to calm the stomach and humble the mind. Basically, drink this tea, and remember that the spirits are watching, Because here's the unifying theme across these cultures. Alcohol wasn't casual. It wasn't bottomless brunch with the girls. It was sacred, symbolic, and violating that symbolism came with consequences. Not just physical, but moral and cosmic. Which makes the hangover not just a headache, but a reckoning. You didn't just suffer because you drank too much. You suffered because you forgot your place in the universe. The spirits, the ancestors, the land itself, all were watching, and your dry mouth and throbbing skull. That was the universe giving you a side eye and whispering, "Do better." Let that sink in. So here you are, hunched over a stone basin in the Yucatan jungle, clutching your head, wondering if the gods will ever forgive you. You've eaten a root that tastes like burned soap, sweated in a steam hut, and maybe had something poured into an orifice that doesn't usually drink, and still you live. A little more humble, a little more quiet. The hangover has passed, but the lesson? That sticks with you. Because in the ancient Americas, the cure wasn't just about feeling better, it was about being better. And now, we turn to a time and place that knew all too well what it meant to drink away the misery, and wake up with more of it. Grab your ash wine and eel pie. We're heading to medieval Europe. The year is... The tavern is packed. The ale is warm. The rats are unusually friendly. You're a medieval peasant, which means you drink beer like it's water. Because, well, it is safer than water. You've spent the day ploughing fields, dodging plague rumors, and contemplating your eternal damnation. So naturally you end the night guzzling 5 pints of cloudy ale, brewed by a man with no teeth and questionable hygiene. You wake up the next morning with your head pounding, your mouth tasting like someone boiled an old boot in it, and a creeping suspicion that you may have confessed your sins to a chicken. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Alcohol in medieval Europe wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Clean water was a gamble. Ale, at least it was boiled. Even children drank it, what historians generously call small beer, low in alcohol, high in medieval sadness. But the strong stuff? That was for celebrations, weddings, harvest feasts, and anything involving bagpipes. And when you overdid it, the hangover was seen not as a medical issue, but a moral one. You were punished by God. Or by demons. Or by that shady monk who swore the wine was only slightly possessed. So what did medieval folks do when the hangover hit harder than a Black Death rumor? Well, the first step was blame. You blamed the tavern. You blamed the moon. You blamed your cousin for bringing that cursed fiddle. Self-reflection would come later. Maybe. Then came the cures. And oh boy, were they creative. Some apothecaries recommended a thick syrup made from crushed rosemary, vinegar, and ashes. Others swore by dried eel skin wrapped around your forehead. One 14th century remedy involved soaking a piece of bread in wine, stuffing it with mint and rue, then applying it directly to your stomach while chanting the Lord's Prayer. Because if you're going to be miserable, you might as well be theatrically miserable. Another popular treatment, a concoction charmingly called drunkard's powder, which might include ground pearls, lead shavings, or dirt scraped from a church wall. It was sold by travelling quacks who promised instant relief and who mysteriously vanished the next morning. But let's talk about the wedding. Picture it. A muddy village, garlands of flowers, a roasting pig, and a barrel of ale as tall as a horse. Everyone is dancing, the bride is radiant, the groom is shirtless, and yelling about taxes. By morning, the bride wakes up with a headache, so fierce, she genuinely believes her husband is a demon in disguise. She screams. He vomits. The priest arrives to calm everyone down with a bucket of lavender and a reminder that God is watching. It sounds ridiculous, but that story, recorded in a 15th century parish chronicle, was used as a cautionary tale. Drink too much, and not only will your soul suffer, your marriage might, too. Still, not every remedy was nonsense. Some monks experimented with herbal tonics, blending gentian, wormwood, and ginger to soothe the stomach and balance the humours. The theory of humours, that your body was governed by 4 fluids, was medical gospel at the time. Headache, too much yellow bile, nausea, clearly your black bile had thrown a tantrum. So you drink a bitter brew, bleed a little from the ankle, and hope the leeches were in a good mood. Even better, some monasteries developed what might be the first branded hangover cures. A Benedictine abbey in what's now Belgium sold a tonic called Sanctum Spiritum, which claimed to revive the spirit and quiet the tremors. Ingredients: secret. Effectiveness: debatable. Branding: on point. There were also charms and amulets. Hangovers were thought to be curses, sometimes literally. So you might wear a carved bone around your neck, or carry a scrap of scripture written backwards. If you were rich or delusional, you could even pay a local wise woman to undown the wine spirit from your body using chants, smoke, and occasionally a dead frog. Sleep well. And in case you think this nonsense was limited to peasants and country bumpkins, think again. Nobles partied even harder. They held banquets that lasted for days, with courses of eel pie, peacock, and jellied meat, all washed down with claret and mead. One chronicler describes a baron so hungover he lay in bed for 2 full days with cabbage leaves on his face, and a bucket of rose water under his nose. Did it help? Probably not. But at least he smelled like salad. Let's not forget the role of religion. Hangovers were seen as divine punishment, so confession was a common cure. You'd stumble into church, head throbbing, eyes bloodshot, and confess to gluttony, pride, and possibly attempting to kiss a statue of Saint Barbara. The priest would sigh, assign you a prayer, and maybe splash some holy water on you, which honestly just felt refreshing. And yet, for all the madness, there's something oddly comforting here, because beneath the curses and cures, the folk wisdom and eel compresses, lies a basic truth. Humans have always tried to feel better after bad choices. We've always sought relief, even if it meant sniffing onions, eating ashes, or pouring wine on our stomachs, and hoping it was close enough to ingestion. Let that sink in through the fog of history, and the stench of spoiled ale. People were doing whatever they could to make the morning after a little less awful. So the next time you wake up with a headache and reach for ibuprofen, remember your medieval ancestors. They didn't have pills. They had leech water and rosemary dirt, and they got through it. Sort of. Now brace yourself, because the next chapter takes us to a time when reason returned, but sanity most definitely did not. We're headed into the Renaissance, and trust me, things are about to get even weirder. The Renaissance, an age of rebirth, rediscovery, and deeply questionable decisions involving unicorns and wine. You'd think with all that classical knowledge making a comeback, someone would have cracked the code on hangovers. Maybe they'd find relief in Aristotle, or Galen, or at least invent something useful, like hydration. But no, instead, they leaned hard into a glittering buffet of bizarre elixirs, powdered nonsense, and philosophical regret, because nothing says intellectual awakening like vomiting into a gold-plated basin. Let's set the scene. It's Venice. 1512. You are a minor noble, with major self-esteem issues. You've spent the evening at a masked ball, drinking sweet red wine from a goblet shaped like a lion's head. You recited poetry. You probably insulted a Medici. Someone passed around candied eels. You don't remember the end. You wake up at noon wearing someone else's cape, and your own shame. Your valet hands you a remedy. Wine infused with gold leaf. Yes, actual gold. Because clearly the answer to your throbbing skull is to drink money. This was believed to revitalize the spirits, and maybe it did, if your spirits were into gastrointestinal distress. But that's just the start. Welcome to the glittering circus of Renaissance hangover cures, where snake oil wasn't just a metaphor, it was often literal. First up, unicorn horn powder, which wasn't unicorn horn. It was narwhal tusk, imported at great expense and ground into a fine dust. Wealthy merchants and panicked dukes sprinkled it into wine, believing it would cure poisons, plagues, and poor decisions. Science? Optional. Price tag? Astronomical. Effectiveness? Let's just say the unicorns were not avenged. Meanwhile, apothecaries were having a field day, with new trade routes opening up. Europe was suddenly flooded with exotic ingredients: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and opium. Yes, opium. One popular morning after elixir combined rose water, saffron, and a generous dollop of laudanum, a tincture of alcohol and opium. The idea was simple. If your headache didn't go away, at least you wouldn't care anymore. These were sold as comforting cordials, usually wrapped in Latin quotes and poetic lies. And because regulation didn't exist, every bottle was a gamble. One might cure your headache. The next might help you astrally project into the fourth dimension. But the Renaissance wasn't just about ingredients. It was about ritual. Let's revisit our hungover Venetian noble. After the gold leaf wine, he follows his phys's advice and spends 2 hours breathing deeply in a garden filled with thyme and orange blossoms. He listens to a boy sing madrigals. Then he's instructed to gently inhale the smoke of a rosemary candle, specially crafted to clear the humors. That's right, the hangover candle. It was real. Some households lit them every morning after a feast. The smell? Equal parts herbal apothecary and pure desperation. Then came the food. A Renaissance hangover breakfast might include soft cheese, pickled cherries, rose petal jam, and warm beer, stirred with honey. Sometimes even blood pudding, because apparently the goal was to make your stomach forget it ever had standards. Oh, and don't forget the waking birds. There are documented cases, yes, really, of nobles hiring small choirs, or flute players, to perform gentle music at their bedside as they recovered from hangovers. One Florentine diary describes the dulcet voice of a boy soprano easing the torment of the wine devil. The wine devil, in case you're wondering, was not metaphorical. People believed hangovers were demons squatting in your brain. So, naturally you tried to charm them out with music. But let's get darker, because for every singing boy and unicorn powder remedy, there were folks with no gold leaf, no candle, no flattering choir. Peasants drank bad wine, often sour or cut with vinegar, and when they got hangovers, which they did, their remedies were simpler and sadder. They chewed mint. They dunked their heads in freezing water. They stuffed lavender in their ears. And sometimes, they just didn't go to work, which meant risking their already precarious livelihood, because their boss was a 3-glass-a-day kind of tyrant. For the poor, hangovers weren't a joke. They were economic punishment. Still, even in the trenches of early capitalism, creativity bloomed. In a small town in France, one widow became famous for selling hangover pies, meat pies filled with dried herbs, mustard seed, and crushed grapes. Locals swore by them. She said they were blessed by Saint Urban, the patron saint of winemakers. Spoiler, they were probably blessed by leftover stew and desperation. The Renaissance also gave us something dangerous: confidence. People thought they were smarter than the ancients, more sophisticated, more medically savvy, but they still rubbed goose fat on their temples and hoped a dead mole in the chimney would fix their migraine, because some habits apparently are immortal. And if you want an emblematic tale, here's one for the scrolls. A minor noble named Giulio Ferretti, known for his extravagant parties, documented in a private journal how he handled post-feast recovery. After consuming 9 cups of white vernaccia and the thigh of a dancing pheasant, he woke to such agony that he performed what he called a divine purge, an hour of reciting psalms while sitting in a tub of tepid goat's milk. When asked days later if it worked, he wrote only, "I wept, but the birds sang sweetly." Make of that what you will. So what do we take from all this? That even during an age of enlightenment, human beings were still just human. Brilliant, foolish, desperately hungover humans. They tried luxury, they tried science, they tried superstition, incense and musical therapy, but in the end, the cure never time, regret, and maybe some cheese. So yeah, if you've ever woken up after a night of sparkling wine and self-delusion, just remember, someone 500 years ago did the same thing, and they tried to fix it with unicorn dust and a singing orphan. Sleep on that. If you've ever looked at a bottle of gin and thought this tastes like regret mixed with pine needles, congratulations, you've channeled the spirit of 18th century England. Let's time travel to the streets of London during the gin craze. A 2-decade-long societal experiment in how quickly a city can dissolve into alcohol-soaked chaos. Picture narrow alleys, crumbling tenements, and nearly every citizen, from chimney sweeps to cobblers, clutching a clay cup of what they called mother's ruin. Spoiler, it did not involve mothers in a comforting sense. At one point, gin was so cheap, it cost less than beer, water, or common decency. Parliament tried taxing it. The people rioted. They banned it. People made it in their bathtubs. Infants were given gin to stop crying. And when they cried harder, more gin. But what happened the morning after? Well, that's where things get bleak. Imagine you're Judith D., a 17-year-old servant girl in a household of 3 snobs, 4 ungrateful children, and 1 deeply suspicious cat. You're allowed 1 evening off every month, and last night, You spent it with your friend Lizzie behind a fishmonger's stall drinking gin out of a shoe. You remember laughing. You remember falling. You do not remember the part where you apparently serenaded a horse. Now it's dawn. You wake up on a cold floor. Your head feels like someone poured gravel into it and shook. Your mouth is dry enough to absorb sunlight. And the fire's out. Here comes the cure. Not tea, not toast, but something Judith read in a leaflet, handed out by a street preacher. Boiling vinegar and mustard powder, sniffed deeply while kneeling in prayer. A holy hangover, if you will. So she boils vinegar. The fumes nearly blind her. She faints directly into the fireplace. Judith survives, with scorched skirts and one less eyebrow. But she never drinks gin again, for almost 2 weeks. This was not unusual. The hangover cures of early modern England ran the full spectrum of what if this works. To please don't try this at home. Doctors, the real kind, with powdered wigs and syphilitic optimism, recommended blistering agents to draw out the poisoned spirits. That's right. They believed hangovers came from corrupted bodily vapors, and the solution was to give yourself a mild burn to coax them out, like trying to fix your hangnail with a bonfire. Others tried more palatable fixes. Ale possets, warm beer mixed with milk and spices, were popular among the upper crust. They also smelled like a barn on fire, but that didn't stop anyone. Poorer folks just chewed parsley and hoped God wasn't too annoyed. Speaking of God, religion, and hangovers, in this period, had a complicated relationship. The Puritans, with their thrilling stance on joy, they were against it. Viewed drunkenness as a moral failure. If you woke up sick, that was divine punishment. You weren't just hungover, you were morally compromised. This belief led to an entire industry of moralizing hangover pamphlets. These were cheaply printed leaflets that featured woodcuts of drunkards lying in the gutter while death, often wearing a monocle for some reason, stood nearby with a clock and a knowing look. These pamphlets usually ended with a quote like, "He who sippeth shall suffer, but he who abstaineth shall inherit warm broth." Uplifting stuff. But of course, real life is never that tidy. People still drank, a lot, and many of them, especially women, drank in secret, in alleyways or kitchens, behind curtained windows with the baby asleep in the next room. Gin became the comfort of the overworked and overlooked. And the cure, often just time, maybe a little bread soaked in milk, maybe lying down and pretending your soul hadn't left your body through your ears. Still, some got creative. In 1734, a man named Barnaby Pigeon, self-declared hangover healer of Houndsditch, opened a shop selling cures for the drinker's punishment. His best-selling remedy, a concoction of wormwood, pepper, and stale port wine. The label claimed it restores the wit and warms the entrails. Most customers described it as a betrayal in liquid form. But that didn't stop the sales. Londoners were desperate, especially since gin, being distilled poorly and often with turpentine or sulfur, left them with more than just headaches. It left blindness, hallucinations and death. This wasn't drinking for fun. This was drinking because the water was unsafe, the air was worse, and the landlord had just raised the rent again. Hangovers in this world weren't punchlines. They were pain layered on pain. The body rebelling against the only thing that made life momentarily tolerable. And yet, they kept drinking. Because gin whispered that everything might be all right, that tomorrow wouldn't come, that maybe, just maybe, this fog would lift. So let's not judge Judith D., or her vinegar experiments, or her 1.5 eyebrows. Let's remember her as a symbol of perseverance, a girl who drank gin from a shoe, took a sermon in liquid form, and still woke up the next day to scrub the master's socks. Because that's the thing about history's hangovers. They weren't just physical, they were economic, emotional, existential, and somehow, people still survived them. Not all hangovers come with headaches. Some come with silence, with the weight of a memory you didn't mean to make, with the foggy whisper of a name you shouldn't have said out loud, or the realization you finally did. This chapter isn't about cabbage juice or barley poultices, it's about the morning after when your stomach's fine. But your soul, not so much. Let's rewind the concept of the hangover, peel back the layers. At its root, it's not just dehydration, it's regret, guilt. That peculiar brand of human self-sabotage where we chase euphoria until it turns on us. Ancient people understood this, maybe even better than we do. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there are references to the fool who drinks without restraint, whose soul is stained with the fog of shame, not a hangover described in terms of bile or vomit, but as a moral stain, something that lingers long after the wine is gone. In other words, ancient Egyptians had a word for drunk regret. And let's be honest, if you're praying to Anubis to forgive you for what you said to your cousin at the harvest banquet, you've already walked this path. Greek literature practically marinates in emotional hangover. Take Euripides' Bacchae, a play where the entire plot is basically one long spiritual hangover. Dionysus, the god of wine, theatre, and bad decisions, shows up in Thebes to remind everyone that suppressing joy is a terrible idea. The result? Ecstatic parties, followed by murder, followed by soul-curdling remorse. Fun times. Even the ever-composed Stoics couldn't sit their way out of emotional consequence. Seneca, that Roman buzzkill in a toga, once wrote that drunkenness uncovers the soul. And what a terrifying phrase that is. Because when the soul is uncovered, what if you don't like what you see? Fast forward to medieval sermons and you'll find priests warning that wine is the devil's ink, and the drunk is merely writing his sins in red. There's poetic flair to it, but also truth. Drunken confessions, missteps, kisses you shouldn't have given, words you can't take back. In a 12th century Welsh manuscript, there's a short poem written by an anonymous monk. It reads, "I drank too deeply at St. John's feast, laughed too loud, danced with the cook, now silence wraps me like a cloak. God, why does joy feel like a hook?" There's no recipe in that stanza, no mention of goose fat or holy water, just the ache of a man who realizes joy came at too steep a price. Even in the Andean highlands, where rituals involving chicha were sacred and communal, there are oral histories passed down about individuals who drank too much and spoke truths that could not be unsaid. Some were punished, others became shamans, because speaking the unfiltered truth, even drunk, was sometimes seen as divine madness. It's a blurry line between revelry and revelation. And modern hangovers? They've inherited all of it. The shame spiral, the dread, the "did I really say that" loop you replay like a cursed podcast episode at 3 a.m. But here's where it gets tender. Because this isn't just about mortification. This is about the universality of regret. Across 6,000 years, humans have woken up clutching their heads and their hearts, wondering not just what they did, but why they keep doing it. Wondering if they're the only ones who feel this way. Spoiler, they're not. One Babylonian clay tablet records a man writing an ode to Ninkasi, goddess of beer. He praises her gifts, but ends the poem with a plea. "Take back thy sweetness, leave me not broken, restore what I gave to the stars." In one sense, he's just hungover. In another, he's reckoning with emptiness. That unshakable truth that sometimes we seek inebriation, not to feel more, but to feel less. And that when it fades, we're left facing what we tried to drown. This is the part history books don't usually cover. Because it's not as easy to quantify a bruised heart. There are no archaeological tools for embarrassment residue or emotional hangover scale. You won't find ancient measuring cups labeled 1 regret 3 amphorae of wine. But the emotional hangover leaves traces. In papyri, in poems, in plays, in prayers, scratched into chapel walls. It's there in the way a character in a saga falls silent, in the way a medieval apothecary recommends valerian, not just for nausea, but for spirits low and restless. Sometimes the cure wasn't physical at all. It was confession. It was a ritual bath, a song, a fast, or simply time. And sometimes there was no cure, just the slow rebuilding of trust, of self, of hope, that next time it'll be different. It rarely was, but the hope was always there. So tonight, if you're nursing something more than a dry mouth, if you're carrying a memory you wish you hadn't made, know this, you're not alone. You're walking a very, very old path, lit by torchlight, echoing with the same whispered apologies and promises to change. History won't judge you for it. It's too busy holding your hair back. It's the morning after. Not just a morning, the archetypal one. The bleary-eyed sunrise humanity's been crawling toward for millennia. Across the ages, across the ruins, across hotel rooms and temple courtyards alike, the headache still lingers. And so does the question, why do we keep doing this to ourselves? Spoiler, this chapter won't answer that, but it will remind you that you're in excellent company. Because, despite 6,000 years of fermented beverages and absolutely no shortage of terrible decisions, humans have stubbornly, almost admirably, refused to learn from the past when it comes to drinking. Or more accurately, when it comes to the part after drinking. Let's review. The Mesopotamians blamed beer demons and called in the priests. The Egyptians wrote cautionary hymns and applied cabbage to the forehead. The Greeks philosophized about moderation with one hand on the amphora. The Romans fried canaries and called it science. Medieval Europeans snorted ash, prayed for mercy, and dunked themselves in rivers. And today? Well, today we've got Instagram infographics, TikTok tinctures, overpriced vitamin IV drips, and wellness influencers shoving activated charcoal down your throat at brunch. Progress? Kind of. There's still no universal cure, no golden pill, no three-step guaranteed reset button. Just like in Babylon, just like in Venice, the next morning still arrives with pounding clarity and the sour taste of why did I text them? And yet, we keep searching. Modern science does tell us more than ancient herbalists ever could. We now know alcohol dehydrates, disrupts REM sleep, inflames the gut, and drains electrolytes like a medieval barber drains blood. We can name the toxins: acetaldehyde, cytokines, histamines. We know why we feel terrible, but knowing isn't healing. Because what we crave isn't just relief, it's redemption. We want to feel okay again, to reclaim dignity, to unsend the email, to put the pieces back into the bottle along with the gin and shame. And so, just like our ancestors, we reach for rituals, hydration apps, greasy breakfasts, cold plunges, hair of the dog, electrolyte powders with packaging so aggressive you'd think they cured debt. We're still human, still hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time will be different. Maybe this juice cleanse or that magic capsule will undo last night's karaoke choices. Spoiler again, they won't. But the hope is the point, because there's something weirdly noble about this whole mess. Something oddly beautiful in the fact that from Neolithic farmers to modern finance bros, we've all faced the same morning mirror. We've all winced at the light. We've all promised, never again. And then, of course, again, tequila exists. So what have we learnt? Well, here's a short list. Humans are endlessly creative, especially when desperate and queasy. The line between medicine and myth is paper thin when your head feels like a marching band lives inside it. Even with all our knowledge, we still want comfort more than chemistry. Which means maybe, just maybe, hangovers aren't just physiological punishments. Maybe they're rituals of reckoning, a weird little rite of passage where we face our limits, our impulses, and our highly questionable taste in party snacks. Maybe hangovers are humanity's version of cosmic timeouts. And you know what? That's okay. Because for all our faults, we've never stopped trying to feel better. Whether it's a monk scribbling a desperate prayer, or you Googling does pickle juice help hangovers at 4 a.m., the core behavior is the same. We're searching for relief, for forgiveness, for answers, for balance between indulgence and integrity. And sometimes, what helps isn't a remedy, it's a story. The one where someone else, 2,000 years ago, also drank too much and woke up under a cart next to a goat named Marcus. The one where a medieval bride mistook her hungover groom for a demon and screamed during the vow. The one where your grandfather swears warm beer cures everything, but only if served by a one-eyed man on a Tuesday. Stories soothe in ways science can't. They remind us that the pain isn't just chemical, it's communal and survivable. So, here we are, still hungover, still hopeful, still human. And maybe that's enough. Not the cure, but the comfort. A quiet acknowledgement, whispered across centuries. You're not the first to feel this way. You won't be the last. But you will be okay. Take a sip of water, breathe deeply, forgive yourself a little. The worst part is already over. The worst decision was already made. And if you're here, reading this, congratulations. You've officially outlived thousands of years of hangover cures, and still have your spleen. Not everyone in ancient Rome can say that. And so, we end where every hangover, great or small, ancient or modern, truly ends, on the cold, unforgiving floor. Maybe it's marble, maybe it's packed dirt, Maybe it's the questionable linoleum of a shared dormitory kitchen, but the floor has always been there, ready to cradle our poor life choices as we lie belly down, cheek pressed to the coolness, whispering softly to the universe, I regret everything. History remembers the victors, sure, but the floor remembers the hungover, because the history of hangovers isn't just about medicine, or magic roots, or trying to drink cabbage juice while holding in your shame. It's about something much deeper, a strange, silly, sacred thread that connects everyone from ancient Assyrian brewers to you, still in yesterday's clothes, Googling why does my liver feel sentient? It's about consequences, not the grand, moralistic kind that get carved into stone tablets, but the petty, squishy, oh dear God, why did I eat that bacon-wrapped scorpion at 3 a.m. kind. The ones that echo in your skull at sunrise and remind you that yes, even the gods can't save you from the third bottle of temple wine. And that's oddly comforting. Because if history has taught us anything at all, it's that no matter where you're from, what century you woke up in, or how many camel-based cocktails you consumed at the Festival of Hathor, you are not alone. Everyone has been here. Gilgamesh probably woke up on a Sumerian bench and groaned, never again. Cleopatra, hungover from a diplomatic wine-off with Mark Antony, probably muttered, what was in that date liquor? Shakespeare wrote entire plays around people who looked like they'd eaten regret with a side of despair. And so we gather, as one bloated, dehydrated species, on the floor of history. There's no cure. That's the bad news. But here's the better news. We've gotten very, very good at surviving it. Whether it's with leeches or Lucozade, beet soup or beef ramen, cucumber compresses, or just hiding in the dark for 12 hours while whispering affirmations to your kidneys, we make it through. Humanity is nothing if not resilient. Consider this. We invented alcohol before the wheel. We managed to ferment honey, rice, barley, grapes, bananas, and possibly tree bark, long before we figured out indoor plumbing. But even before the first plumbing system existed, someone somewhere woke up, licked the inside of their mouth and said, I think I may have gone too far. And that person? That pioneer of regret? That's your ancestor. Spiritually, at least. Because maybe, just maybe, the most honest part of human civilization isn't the pyramid or the aqueduct. It's the person curled in the corner of a stone floor, whispering, I think I'll just live here now. Let that sink in. Not the tile. The idea. Maybe we've spent too much time idolizing our empires, our monuments, our treaties and triumphs. Maybe the real universal human experience isn't war or invention. Maybe it's waking up with your face in an amphora wondering what happened to your dignity. Because in those moments, stripped of ego, stripped of pretense, clutching a stale piece of flatbread and bargaining with deities you don't usually believe in, that's when we're the most us. Unfiltered, humbled, equal. The pharaoh and the peasant, the emperor and the eel vendor, the influencer and the innkeeper, all brought to their metaphorical knees, and occasionally actual knees, by the same reckless joy and its price tag. And that, my floor-lying friends, is kind of beautiful. No matter how far we go, how advanced we become, we still haven't outgrown the urge to dance with disaster, to laugh too hard, drink too much, eat something fermented that may or may not be legal in your country. We still chase the night like fools, and pay for it like prophets. So what do we do with this knowledge? Well, first, hydrate. Seriously. Then maybe, just maybe, we appreciate the hangover. Not as punishment, but as poetry. A strange, groaning love letter from your body reminding you that you're not a god, that you're soft, flawed, squishy, and absolutely terrible at saying no to spiced wine. And maybe that's the point, because the morning after always comes. And with it, clarity, regret, yes, but also reflection. And sometimes, if you're lucky, a story worth telling, or a lesson worth remembering. So next time you wake up feeling like your brain is chewing on aluminum foil, just know this. You're part of something bigger, an ancient, majestic, mortifying tradition, the brotherhood of the brutally hungover. And your initiation? Complete. There's one anonymous Roman once carved on a wine cellar wall, he who drank much shall lie quiet, for the gods do not pity the fool. But hey, we've earned our floor nap. Because in the end, hangovers are more than headaches. They're shared cultural artifacts. They're proof we lived, We laughed. We forgot to eat bread before the third glass of mead, and we'll probably do it again, because humanity doesn't learn. But at least we're entertaining. Survived this historical hangover tour. You're tougher than a Viking with a mead migraine. Tap like, hit subscribe, and share this with the friend who swears pickle juice is a cure, because if history teaches us anything, it's that we never learn.